Bitcoin treasury companies are crashing, and this is actually good news for these companies. My name is Ian Gillespie, and today I will be discussing exactly why these Bitcoin treasuries are crashing and why this is actually good news. As always, this is not financial advice. Let's get started. Now, to understand why the stock is falling here for many of these Bitcoin treasuries, we must first figure out what determines the stock price. So stock price can be calculated by taking the Bitcoin NAV or Bitcoin net asset value, multiplying it by the multiple in that NAV or the MNAV, and then dividing that by the shares outstanding. Of course, the Bitcoin net asset value is just the value of a company's Bitcoin holdings, which can be determined by taking the Bitcoin holdings and multiplying it by the price of Bitcoin. Now, MNAV can also be calculated by taking the market cap minus the debt and then dividing it by the Bitcoin net asset value. So what essentially with these equations brings the stock price up? Well, an increase in Bitcoin holdings, an increase in Bitcoin's price, and then also an increase in MNAV. Of these three things, we have seen these high quality Bitcoin treasuries increase their Bitcoin holdings. And until as of recently, Bitcoin's price has only been going up with a little bit of a drawdown here very recently, but overall it's been on the upwards trend. So we would expect with the increased Bitcoin holdings and increased price of Bitcoin for the stock to be going up in price. However, there are also factors that can bring down the price of one of the Bitcoin treasury stocks. And this includes decreased Bitcoin holdings if a company's Bitcoin gets like liquidated or anything like that occurs, or they decide to sell their Bitcoin, that would definitely tank the stock price. A decreased price of Bitcoin would lower the stock price. Increased debt, which we haven't seen too much of for many of the high quality Bitcoin treasury companies out there. So none of those things mentioned earlier bringing the stock price down is what we've seen from many of these high quality Bitcoin treasuries. But what we have seen is decreased MNAV and an increase in shares outstanding. So the only two things we've really seen from these high quality Bitcoin treasuries that would be bringing the stock price down is a decrease in the MNAV and an increase in the shares outstanding. So again, as mentioned before, that decrease in MNAV and increase in shares outstanding are the reason for a falling stock price. However, an increase in the shares outstanding are used to acquire more Bitcoin because when you're increasing the shares outstanding, you're essentially issuing shares so that you're able to raise more money to buy Bitcoin. So, is the increase in shares outstanding really decreasing the stock price? Well, to determine that, we need to find one of the two following criteria here. If the multiple in the shares outstanding is greater than the multiple of Bitcoin purchased from issuing shares, there's essentially a net loss in share price. However, if the multiple in shares outstanding is less than the value of or the multiple of Bitcoin purchased from issuing those shares, there's essentially a net gain in share price. So which of those two things have we been seeing? I'd argue that for these high quality Bitcoin treasuries, we've been seeing the latter, resulting in a net gain in share price. For example, we can take a look at Metaplanet, although I do believe this applies to many other high quality Bitcoin treasuries, such as Smarter Web. I'm simply doing specific calculations on Metaplanet because they have the most data available with extremely accurate numbers and accurate dates to those numbers. So that is why I'm doing these calculations for Metaplanet specifically because I can get the most precise calculations using Metaplanet specifically here. So if we take a look at their share price on June 30th, they were trading at $11.55. And then on July 28th, they kind of tanked down to $7.65. So there was a drastic decrease in their share price. However, we can take a look at their Bitcoin holdings right down here in the middle box. On June 30th, they had 13,350 Bitcoin. And then on July 28th, they had 17,132 Bitcoin. If we take the number of Bitcoin that they had on July 28th, divide it by the amount that they previously had on June 30th, we get a multiple of 1.28. So between June 30th and July 28th, Metaplanet 1.28x'd their Bitcoin holdings. Now let's take a look at the number of shares outstanding for Metaplanet. On June 30th, they had just over 650 million shares outstanding. And then on July 28th, they had just under 690,000 shares outstanding. So again, we can find the multiple in shares outstanding by taking the shares outstanding on July 28th, dividing it by the shares outstanding on June 30th, and we get a multiple in 1.05. So since the multiple in Bitcoin holdings was greater than the multiple in shares outstanding, they essentially used accretive dilution. So when they issued, yes, they issued more shares, which would theoretically lower the stock price down. But by issuing more shares, they were able to raise more money to buy more Bitcoin. Since by issuing more shares, they were able to get a greater multiple in their Bitcoin holdings than their multiple on shares outstanding, this would essentially be accretive and should theoretically drive stock price back up. However, we haven't necessarily seen that. Why is that? Well, because of MNAV, because of the premium. So in dollar terms, it looks like we're down, but in Bitcoin per share, everything else is up. So we can take a look at Metaplanet's Bitcoin per share chart right here, and we can see it's pretty much nothing but up. It just goes straight up. There's hardly any drawdowns. The Bitcoin per share is just constantly on the rise, and it still is on the rise. Bitcoin per share still is on the rise, but their stock price is down. Now, why is this? So when we bought Metaplanet, we paid a premium, hence the MNAV or the multiple in the net asset value that the market essentially gives to the company. This would give us a less immediate exposure to Bitcoin when we invest in this company compared to buying spot Bitcoin. Because say we're buying Metaplanet at an MNAV of 3, we're essentially directly getting exposure to 1/3 of the amount of Bitcoin that we could get if we just bought Bitcoin directly. Why is this? That's because of this chart right here. Because we believe that over time we will get more Bitcoin per share and that they will be able to essentially cover that premium that we originally paid for by acquiring more Bitcoin per share over time. And then eventually, after we cover that premium, we can continue to simply acquire more Bitcoin just by holding the stock and allowing that company to acquire more Bitcoin over time. So we're paying a premium now, getting exposure to less Bitcoin right now, so that we can later get more Bitcoin than just buying straight up Bitcoin. That's why we pay the premium. And when we look at the Bitcoin per share, Metaplanet is doing nothing but rising. And this is very similar to lots of other high quality Bitcoin treasury companies, including Smarter Web. I believe they are on a very similar path, or we're seeing a very similar path with Smarter Web as we are seeing with Metaplanet here right now. So now, why is the reason for the crash here? I argue that there is absolutely no crash. As we looked at the other slide, the Bitcoin per share is going straight up. Straight up, this is what truly, truly matters. There is no crash. There's just changes in market sentiment leading to a lower premium or that lower MNAV. However, eventually, I'll explain later, I believe that the market sentiment will increase, which will increase the premium later on. And we can see this kind of trend throughout here. So taking a look at Metaplanet's MNAV over time, we can see that early on, Metaplanet was trading at a very high MNAV. The MNAV crashed down. We kind of see this U formation going back up. The premium went back up. And then, of course, we saw a crash down. We saw the premium go right back up here. And then we see another crash down. And I believe we'll see that premium or that MNAV rise back up, creating another U formation here in the near future. Now, why this is, I'll go into a later slide, but it is important to take note that while we do see this U formation, we will see lower highs in MNAV because as a Bitcoin treasury accumulates more Bitcoin, it's going to be more difficult to multiply their Bitcoin holdings. So, for example, if a company holds 1,000 Bitcoin, it's going to be easier for them to trade at a 10 MNAV because it's easier for them to 10x their Bitcoin holdings compared to a company who holds 10,000 Bitcoin. Because to 10x their Bitcoin holdings, they would need to get to 100,000 Bitcoin, which is going to be much more difficult. So I believe over time we will continue to see these cycles where we have a high MNAV, we kind of crash down a little bit, we slowly go back up, and then we have another high MNAV, but slightly lower than the previous high MNAV. Then we go back down, we come back up, have another peak in MNAV that is slightly lower than that previous peak in MNAV. And I believe here we will crash back down and then we'll come back up and we'll see another peak in MNAV that is slightly lower than that previous peak in MNAV. And here's why. This is my reasoning for why we will see these MNAV cycles. So when a market sees a company buying Bitcoin faster and faster, the market is going to price in the belief that the company can create a greater multiple in their Bitcoin holdings, thus the MNAV. This allows the company to buy Bitcoin faster and faster because as that MNAV expands, it increases the share price. As the share price increases, then when the company issues shares, they're raising more capital per share issued, allowing them to raise more money to buy more Bitcoin. So then they're buying Bitcoin faster and faster. And that leads right back into the cycle where the market will see that they're buying Bitcoin faster and faster. So then they're going to continue to price in the belief that they can multiply their Bitcoin holdings faster and faster. However, this is actually not true. As the company grows its Bitcoin holdings, it actually becomes harder to have a greater multiple in Bitcoin holdings. I kind of mentioned that previous on the previous slide. As a company has 1,000 Bitcoin, it's going to be harder to 10x, or it's going to be easier to 10x their Bitcoin compared to a company that has 10,000 Bitcoin. It's going to be harder to 10x their Bitcoin. So while the market sees a company buy Bitcoin faster and faster, the market's pricing in the belief that the company can create a greater multiple in their Bitcoin holdings. But as the company's Bitcoin holdings are increasing, it actually becomes harder to get a greater multiple in those Bitcoin holdings. So then eventually a reprice in the market must occur. So then when the market reprices, they essentially are believing that the company is not worth the multiple in Bitcoin holdings that the market previously claimed that they were worth. This results in a drop in MNAV, which decreases the share price. As the share price decreases, when a company goes to issue those shares, they're able to acquire less capital because the share price is smaller. So when they're issuing shares at a smaller share price, they're not going to be able to accumulate as much Bitcoin because they're able to raise less capital per share issued when share price is lower. That's going to force companies to buy Bitcoin slower and slower. So then the market's going to see that the company is buying Bitcoin slower and slower. And so then they're going to farther price in the belief that the company cannot multiply their Bitcoin as fast, leading to the MNAV compression. And then as they're pricing that into the market, MNAV compresses, share price continues to drop, which causes the company to be able to acquire more Bitcoin per share issued, thus slowing down the ability to purchase more Bitcoin. However, MNAV can only get compressed so far because as MNAV is getting compressed, these companies are still buying Bitcoin and their net asset value is continuing to rise. So eventually, at some point, that in itself is going to force the MNAV back up. When MNAV is forced back up, that'll force the share prices back up. When the share prices go back up, well, then the company can then issue shares at a higher price. So then they're raising more capital per share issued. So then the company can go ahead and buy Bitcoin faster and faster. So then we reset this cycle and then we go back to this first stage where the market sees that the company is buying Bitcoin and faster. And then the market prices in the belief that the company can create a greater multiple in their Bitcoin holdings, thus expanding the MNAV, repeating the cycle, and allowing the Bitcoin treasuries to live on. That is my whole rationale for why I believe we see an MNAV, this kind of MNAV cycle where the MNAV is high, it dips down, it goes back up, it dips back down, it goes back up. I believe this is the whole reasoning that we see this whole MNAV cycle. That is my rationale. And for the conclusion here, here are my final closing thoughts. High quality Bitcoin treasuries are crashing in dollar terms, but in Bitcoin per share terms, the good companies are only going up. And in Bitcoin per share terms, at the end of the day, that's the only thing that truly matters. The only factor that is decreasing the share price of good quality Bitcoin treasuries right now is MNAV is compressing. But as I mentioned before, these cycles of MNAV expansion and compression are expected to happen, and I expect that the MNAV will expand back up for these high quality Bitcoin treasuries. Additionally, an overcompression of MNAV is good to allow the flywheel of MNAV expansion and Bitcoin accumulation to fully restart. And I think that right now it is a very good time to purchase Bitcoin treasuries because of this overcompression in MNAV. I think that the MNAV is going to expand up here in the near future, and that Bitcoin treasuries are going to be able to restart this flywheel, expand their MNAV, and keep buying Bitcoin faster and faster. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, if you like the videos I've been putting out, please consider liking and subscribing to support my work and to support the channel.